David had always been the kind of guy who took pride in his home. Every Saturday morning you could find him outside with his lawnmower, making sure every blade of grass was perfectly cut. His neighbors often joked that his yard looked better than most golf courses. But for David, it wasn't about showing off. It was about respect. Respect for his property, his neighborhood, and the dream he had worked so hard to achieve. 3 years ago, David and his wife Jennifer had finally saved enough money to buy their first house in Oakwood Hills. It wasn't the biggest house on the block, but it was theirs. After years of living in cramped apartments and saving every penny, walking through that front door for the first time felt like winning the lottery. The house came with something David had dreamed about since he was a kid, watching his wealthy uncle's backyard parties: a swimming pool. The pool wasn't huge, but it was perfect for their small family. Their 8-year-old son Tyler learned to swim in that pool during their first summer. David's wife Jennifer loved floating on her inflatable chair after long days at her nursing job. On weekends they would have barbecues and David would grill burgers while Tyler splashed around with his friends. Those were the moments that made all the overtime hours and tight budgets worth it. David worked as a mechanical engineer at a local factory that made car parts. He had always been good with his hands and understood how things worked. When something broke around the house, he usually tried to fix it himself before calling a professional. His garage was organized like a workshop with every tool in its proper place. Jennifer used to tease him about being too organized. But David believed that taking care of your things meant they would take care of you. The neighborhood they lived in was exactly what David had pictured when he imagined owning a home. Tree-lined streets with sidewalks where kids could ride their bikes safely. Houses with front porches where neighbors would wave to each other in the evenings. There was even a small park 2 blocks away where Tyler could play baseball with his friends. Most of the families had lived there for years and everyone seemed to take pride in keeping their properties looking nice. David made it his mission to fit right in. He learned the names of all his neighbors within the first month. When old Mrs. Peterson next door needed help carrying groceries, David was always ready to lend a hand. During the winter, he would shovel not just his own driveway but also the sidewalk in front of his house, and sometimes help his elderly neighbors with theirs. Jennifer often said he was too nice for his own good. But David believed that being a good neighbor was part of being a good person. The Homeowners Association in Oakwood Hills wasn't too strict, which David appreciated. They had basic rules about keeping grass cut, not leaving trash cans out too long, and maintaining a certain standard of appearance. David never had any problems following these rules because he was already doing most of these things naturally. In 3 years of living there, he had never received a single violation notice or complaint. Every month, David would walk around his property to check for any maintenance issues. He would inspect the roof for loose shingles, check the gutters for clogs, and make sure the sprinkler system was working properly. The pool required regular attention too. He tested the water chemistry weekly, cleaned the filter system, and skimmed leaves and debris from the surface. During the winter months, he carefully covered the pool and made sure the equipment was properly winterized. His attention to detail didn't go unnoticed. Several neighbors had complimented David on how well he maintained his property. Mr. Johnson from across the street often said that David's house was the best-looking one on the block. Even the mailman had commented on how nice the front garden looked that Jennifer had planted along the walkway. But by the 3rd year, David started noticing that the pool equipment was showing its age. The filtration system had been installed when the house was built 15 years ago, and it was starting to require more frequent repairs. The pump motor was getting louder, and David could see rust forming on some of the metal components. As an engineer, he knew that trying to patch up old equipment would only lead to bigger problems down the road. After doing some research, David discovered that newer pool systems were much more energy efficient and reliable. The old system was costing them more money each month in electricity bills, and the constant repairs were adding up. Jennifer supported the idea of upgrading, especially when David showed her how much money they could save in the long run with a more efficient system. David spent weeks researching different pool companies and getting quotes for the work. He wanted to make sure he hired someone reputable who would do the job right. He read online reviews, checked with the Better Business Bureau, and even drove by some houses where the companies had done previous work. Finally, he found a contractor who had excellent references and reasonable prices. The process wasn't going to be simple, The old pool would need to be completely removed before the new one could be installed. This meant tearing out the old concrete, removing all the old plumbing and electrical connections, and basically starting from scratch. David knew it would be disruptive for a few weeks, but he believed it was the right thing to do for his family's future. Before signing any contracts, David made sure to check with the city about permits. He discovered that he would need several different permits for the demolition and reconstruction work. The process took almost a month, but David wanted everything done properly and legally. He had worked too hard to get his dream home to risk any problems with the authorities. When David told his immediate neighbors about the upcoming pool renovation, they were all supportive. Mrs. Peterson said she was excited to see the new pool when it was finished. The family with young kids 2 houses down asked if their children could still come over to swim once the new pool was ready. And David assured them they would always be welcome. Everything seemed to be falling into place perfectly. David had the permits, the contractor, and the support of his neighbors. He had saved up enough money to pay for the project without going into debt. Jennifer was excited about having a more reliable pool system. Tyler was looking forward to having his friends over to see the new pool when it was finished. As David looked out at his backyard that evening, watching Tyler practice his swimming strokes in the pool that would soon be gone, he felt confident that he was making the right decision. He had always believed that good planning and hard work led to good results. He had no idea that his careful preparations were about to be tested in ways he never could have imagined. Tuesday morning arrived with clear skies and perfect weather for construction work. David had taken the day off from his job at the factory so he could supervise the pool removal process. He wanted to make sure everything went smoothly and that his property was treated with care. Jennifer had already left for her shift at the hospital, and Tyler was at his summer day camp, so David had the house to himself to focus on the project. At 7:30 in the morning, David heard the rumble of heavy trucks pulling into his driveway. He looked out the window and saw the contractor's crew arriving right on schedule. There were 3 trucks total, one carrying jackhammers and other demolition tools, another with a small excavator, and a third truck pulling a large dumpster trailer. David grabbed his work boots and headed outside to meet the team. The crew chief, a weathered man named Roberto, greeted David with a firm handshake and a friendly smile. Roberto had been doing pool installations and removals for over 20 years, and his experience showed in the way he quickly assessed the worksite and began organizing his team. He walked David around the pool area, pointing out the different steps they would take throughout the day. "First thing we do is disconnect all the electrical and plumbing," Roberto explained, gesturing toward the pool equipment area. "Then we drain whatever water is left and start breaking up the concrete. We work from the shallow end to the deep end. That way we can use the excavator more efficiently." David appreciated Roberto's thoroughness and professional approach. As an engineer, David understood the importance of having a clear plan before starting any project. He had specifically chosen Roberto's company because they had a reputation for clean, organized work sites and satisfied customers. The crew consisted of 5 men who clearly knew what they were doing. They moved with purpose, setting up their equipment and preparing the work area. David noticed that they laid down protective sheets on his lawn to prevent damage from heavy machinery and debris. They also set up safety barriers around the work zone, even though no one else would be home during the day. By 8 o'clock, the actual work began. 2 crew members started disconnecting the electrical connections that powered the pool pump, lights, and other equipment. David watched closely as they carefully labeled each wire and took photos of the connections before removing them. This attention to detail impressed him and confirmed that he had chosen the right contractor. Meanwhile, other crew members began draining the remaining water from the pool. Even though David had partially drained it the weekend before, there was still several inches of water that needed to be pumped out. The sound of the pump motor echoed across the backyard as thousands of gallons of water were directed toward the storm drain in his driveway. David decided to help wherever he could. His engineering background meant he understood the technical aspects of the job, and Roberto welcomed his assistance. Together, they disconnected the main plumbing lines that carried water to and from the pool filter system. David was careful to turn off the main water supply first, and they worked methodically to avoid any accidental leaks or damage. The first real noise came when the crew fired up the jackhammers to begin breaking apart the concrete pool deck surrounding the pool. The sound was loud but not unexpected. David had warned his immediate neighbors about the temporary noise, and everyone had been understanding. Mrs. Peterson had even said she would be at her daughter's house most of the day, so the noise wouldn't bother her. As the morning progressed, David found himself genuinely enjoying the physical work. His job at the factory was more about problem-solving and managing systems, so using his hands to help dismantle the pool was a refreshing change. He worked up a sweat helping to load chunks of broken concrete into wheelbarrows that were then dumped into the large dumpster. Around 10 o'clock, David's neighbor from 2 houses down, a friendly man named Bob, stopped by to see how the work was going. Bob had done some home renovation projects of his own and was curious about the process. David took a break to chat with him and explain what they were doing. "Wow, this is quite an operation," Bob said, watching the crew work with the excavator to remove large sections of the pool wall. "How long is this whole project going to take?" David wiped the sweat from his forehead and took a drink from his water bottle. "Roberto says they'll have all the old stuff removed by Thursday. Then we wait about 2 weeks for the new pool design to be finalized, and the installation should take another week after that." Bob nodded approvingly. "That's not too bad. I bet Tyler's excited about getting a new pool for the rest of the summer." "Oh, he definitely is," David laughed. "He's already planning a pool party for when it's finished." As Bob headed back to his house, David felt good about how supportive his neighbors were being. He had been worried that some people might be annoyed by the noise and disruption, but everyone seemed to understand that home improvements were part of living in a neighborhood. The work continued steadily throughout the morning. The crew had developed an efficient rhythm. Some men operated the heavy machinery while others cleared debris and prepared the next section for demolition. David was impressed by how organized they kept the worksite. Despite the nature of demolition work, they managed to keep the mess contained and organized. By noon, significant progress had been made. The pool deck was completely removed and about half of the actual pool structure had been broken up and hauled away. David could see the shape of his future backyard beginning to emerge. The area looked much larger without the old pool taking up space, and he was already imagining how nice the new pool would look in the same spot. Roberto called for a lunch break, and the crew gathered in the shade of David's garage to eat their sandwiches and rest. David joined them, bringing out a cooler of cold drinks that he had prepared for the workers. He believed in treating people well, especially those who were working hard on his property. During lunch, David learned more about the crew members. Most of them had been working together for several years, and they clearly enjoyed their jobs. They told David stories about other pool projects they had worked on, including some challenging removal jobs that had required creative solutions. Their experience and positive attitudes made David even more confident that his project was in good hands. The afternoon shift brought even more progress. The excavator made quick work of the remaining pool walls, and the crew continued their systematic approach to clearing debris. David noticed that they were being very careful not to damage his lawn or landscaping around the pool area. They used plywood sheets to protect the grass when moving heavy equipment, and they kept their work contained to the smallest possible area. Around 3 o'clock, David's phone rang. It was Jennifer calling from the hospital during her break to check on how things were going. "Everything's going great," David told her. "These guys really know what they're doing. I think we'll actually be ahead of schedule." "That's wonderful," Jennifer replied. "Tyler keeps texting me asking for updates. He's so excited he can barely concentrate on his camp activities." David chuckled. "Well, you can tell him that by the time he gets home, he's going to see a very different backyard." As the afternoon wore on, David felt a deep sense of satisfaction watching his vision become reality. The old, outdated pool system was being efficiently removed, making way for something better and more reliable. The crew continued to work with the same professional attitude they had shown all day, and David knew he had made the right choice in contractors. By 5 o'clock, Roberto announced that they had made excellent progress and would be wrapping up for the day. The majority of the pool structure had been removed, and what remained would be easily finished the next morning. The worksite was cleaned up, tools were loaded back onto the trucks, and safety barriers were put in place for the night. As the crew prepared to leave, Roberto reviewed the next day's plan with David. They would finish removing the last sections of concrete, complete the excavation work, and have the site ready for the new pool installation team. Everything was proceeding exactly as planned. David stood in his backyard that evening looking at the progress that had been made. Where his old pool had been that morning, there was now a carefully excavated area ready for something new and better. He felt proud of the project and confident that his family's investment in their home was going to pay off for years to come. David was reviewing the afternoon work schedule with Roberto when he noticed a white car pulling into his driveway. He didn't recognize the vehicle, but he figured it might be another neighbor stopping by to check on the progress. Throughout the morning, several people had walked by or stopped to chat, and everyone had been friendly and supportive of the renovation project. A woman stepped out of the car, and David immediately noticed her stern expression and the clipboard she carried. She was middle-aged with short blonde hair and wore a business suit that seemed oddly formal for a casual neighborhood visit. David had seen her around the neighborhood before but had never actually met her. He knew she lived several houses down the street, but they had never had occasion to interact. The woman walked briskly toward the worksite, her high heels clicking on the concrete driveway. David wiped his hands on a towel and approached her with a friendly smile, assuming she was probably just curious about the renovation like his other neighbors had been. "Good afternoon," David said politely. "I'm David. Are you here to check out the pool renovation?" The woman stopped abruptly and looked at David with an expression that immediately made him uncomfortable. There was no warmth in her eyes, no neighborly friendliness that he had come to expect from people in Oakwood Hills. "I'm Patricia Coleman," she said in a sharp voice. "I'm the compliance officer for the Oakwood Hills Homeowners Association, and I need to see your permits for this construction activity." The way she said construction activity made it sound like David was doing something suspicious or illegal. He was taken aback by her hostile tone but remained calm and professional. As an engineer, David was used to dealing with inspectors and officials, so he knew the importance of staying cooperative even when someone was being unreasonable. "Of course," David replied. "I have all the permits right here. Let me grab them for you." David walked over to a plastic folder he had set up on a small table near the work site. Inside were all his documents: the city demolition permit, the construction permit for the new pool, proof of insurance from Roberto's company, and even the original plans that had been approved by the city planning department. He had learned to keep everything organized and easily accessible. Patricia snatched the folder from David's hands without saying thank you and began flipping through the documents rapidly. David could see that she was looking for something to complain about, not actually trying to understand what the permits covered. Her body language was aggressive, and she kept shaking her head and making disapproving sounds. "This demolition work is creating excessive noise," Patricia announced, not looking up from the paperwork. "The HOA has noise restrictions, and this level of disruption is unacceptable." David was confused because he had checked the HOA rules carefully before beginning the project. "I'm sorry, but I reviewed the noise regulations and we're working well within the permitted hours. All the heavy work is being done between 8 a.m. and 5 p.m. on weekdays, which is exactly what the rules allow." Patricia finally looked up from the papers and David could see anger in her eyes. "Don't tell me what the rules say. I enforce these rules every day and I know when violations are occurring." Roberto, who had been quietly observing the conversation, stepped forward. As an experienced contractor, he had dealt with difficult HOA officials before and knew how to handle these situations professionally. "Ma'am, I'm Roberto Gonzalez from Premier Pool Services," he said, extending his hand for a handshake that Patricia ignored. "We're a licensed and insured company, and we always follow all local regulations. Here's our business license and the insurance certificate." Patricia barely glanced at Roberto's documentation before turning her attention back to David. "I also need to verify that you actually have authority to make these modifications to this property. How do I know you're the actual homeowner?" David couldn't believe what he was hearing. The question felt both absurd and insulting. He had been living in the neighborhood for 3 years, maintaining his property better than most people, and had never had any issues with anyone. Now this woman was questioning his right to improve his own home. "I can show you the property deed if you'd like," David said, trying to keep his voice steady. "But I'm not sure why that would be necessary. I've lived here for 3 years and have never had any violations or complaints." Patricia's expression became even more hostile. "I don't care how long you claim to have lived here. I need to see proof of ownership, and I need to understand exactly what kind of work is being done here." David felt his patience beginning to wear thin, but he continued to respond professionally. He walked into his house and returned with a copy of his property deed, his homeowner's insurance policy, and even his most recent property tax statement. He laid everything out on the table for Patricia to examine. While Patricia was looking through his documents, David noticed that some of his neighbors had started to gather nearby. Mrs. Peterson was standing in her front yard, clearly concerned about the confrontation happening next door. Bob from 2 houses down had come outside and was watching the situation unfold. Even the family with young children across the street had come out onto their front porch. Patricia spent several minutes examining David's paperwork, clearly hoping to find some error or discrepancy she could use against him. When she couldn't find any problems with his documentation, she shifted her focus to the worksite itself. "This debris and mess is a violation of community standards," she declared, gesturing toward the organized piles of concrete that were waiting to be loaded into the dumpster. "This kind of industrial waste cannot be stored on residential property." Roberto couldn't help but speak up. "Ma'am, that's temporary construction debris that's being removed as we work. We'll have everything cleaned up by the end of each day, and the dumpster will be gone by Thursday evening." Patricia turned on Roberto with surprising hostility. "I wasn't talking to you. This is a matter between the homeowner and the HOA. David felt his anger rising but forced himself to stay calm. "Roberto is right, though. All of this debris is temporary, and everything will be cleaned up according to the timeline we established with the city permits." "I don't care what timeline you think you have," Patricia snapped. "I'm telling you that this current situation violates HOA standards, and I'm prepared to issue fines starting immediately." David looked at the work site and then back at Patricia. Everything was neat and organized. The crew had been careful to protect his lawn and surrounding landscaping. The debris was contained in the designated dumpster or in organized piles that would be removed within hours. He couldn't understand what she was actually complaining about. "Can you please explain specifically which HOA rule we're violating?" David asked. "Because I've reviewed the regulations carefully and I believe we're in full compliance." Patricia's face turned red with anger. "Don't try to lawyer me, young man. I know a violation when I see one, and I don't need you questioning my authority." The way she said "young man" carried a tone that made David very uncomfortable. Combined with her earlier questioning of his ownership of the property, he was beginning to sense that this confrontation might be about more than just HOA regulations. Mrs. Peterson, who had been watching from her yard, finally walked over to join the conversation. "Excuse me," she said to Patricia, "but David has been a wonderful neighbor for 3 years. He's always been respectful about any work he does on his property." Patricia turned toward Mrs. Peterson with the same hostile expression. "This is official HOA business, and residents should not interfere with compliance investigations." David felt grateful for Mrs. Peterson's support, but he didn't want to drag his neighbors into what was becoming an increasingly unpleasant situation. "It's okay, Mrs. Peterson, I'm sure we can work this out." But Patricia was far from finished. She began taking pictures of the worksite with her phone, muttering about violations and fines. She photographed the dumpster, the organized debris piles, and even the tools that Roberto's crew was using. Her behavior was becoming more aggressive and unreasonable by the minute. "I'm filing formal complaints with both the HOA board and the city," Patricia announced loudly, apparently wanting all the gathering neighbors to hear her. "This type of activity cannot be allowed to continue in our community." Roberto tried once more to de-escalate the situation. "Ma'am, if there's any specific concern about our work methods, I'd be happy to address it. We want to be good neighbors." Patricia pointed her finger at Roberto. "I don't need to discuss anything with you. This is between me and the property owner." David felt a surge of anger at the way Patricia was treating Roberto, who had been nothing but professional and respectful throughout the entire interaction. "Roberto is here at my request, working on my property with proper permits. He has every right to participate in this conversation." Patricia gathered up her clipboard and papers with dramatic flair. "We'll see about that. I'm calling this in to the proper authorities immediately." As she stomped back toward her car, Patricia turned around one final time. "This isn't over," she said loudly enough for all the neighbors to hear. "I'm going to make sure this unauthorized activity is stopped." David watched her drive away, feeling frustrated and confused. In just 15 minutes, what had been a perfectly normal home improvement project had somehow become a neighborhood controversy. He looked around at his neighbors, who were all watching with expressions of concern and support. "I'm sorry you all had to witness that," David said to the small crowd that had gathered. "I honestly don't know what that was about." Mrs. Peterson shook her head in disgust. "David, you don't have anything to apologize for. That woman was completely out of line." But even as his neighbors offered their support, David had a sinking feeling that Patricia's threats weren't empty. Something told him this confrontation was just the beginning of his problems. 20 minutes after Patricia drove away, David was helping Roberto's crew load the last pieces of broken concrete into the dumpster when he heard the unmistakable sound of car doors slamming. He looked up to see 2 police cars pulling into his driveway, their lights flashing but no sirens wailing. His heart immediately started racing and a cold feeling spread through his stomach. David had never been in trouble with the law in his entire life. He had never even received a speeding ticket. The sight of police officers walking toward his property filled him with a mixture of confusion and fear. He couldn't imagine what they could possibly want, but he suspected it had something to do with Patricia's threats from earlier. 2 officers approached the worksite, and David could see them taking in the scene, the demolished pool area, the construction equipment, and the workers who had stopped what they were doing to watch nervously. David wiped his dusty hands on his jeans and walked toward the officers, trying to appear calm and cooperative despite the anxiety churning in his chest. The first officer was a tall, middle-aged man with graying hair and a serious expression. His name tag read Officer Williams. The second officer was younger, probably in his 30s, with dark hair and a more relaxed demeanor. His name tag said Officer Rodriguez. "Good afternoon," Officer Williams said in a professional tone. "Are you the homeowner here?" "Yes, sir, I'm David Thompson," David replied, grateful that his voice sounded steadier than he felt. "Is there some kind of problem?" Officer Williams pulled out a small notebook and pen. "We received a call about suspicious construction activity and possible property damage occurring at this address. The caller reported that there might be unauthorized demolition work happening here." David felt a wave of disbelief wash over him. Suspicious activity? Unauthorized demolition? He looked around at his perfectly legal, properly permitted home renovation project and struggled to understand how anyone could characterize it that way. "I can assure you that everything we're doing here is completely legal and authorized," David said. "I have all the proper permits from the city, and this is a legitimate pool renovation project." Officer Rodriguez stepped forward with a slightly friendlier expression. "We're sure it probably is, sir, but we have to respond to all complaints, even when they turn out to be misunderstandings. Could we see some identification and the permits you mentioned?" David felt relief that the officers seemed reasonable and professional. He retrieved his driver's license from his wallet and went to get the folder containing all his project documentation. As he handed the papers to Officer Williams, he noticed that several more neighbors had come outside to see what was happening. The sight of police cars in the quiet neighborhood had definitely attracted attention. Officer Williams carefully examined David's identification, comparing the address on his license to the house number. He then began reviewing the permits, taking his time to understand what each document authorized. "These all look legitimate," Officer Williams said after several minutes. You've got a demolition permit, a construction permit, and all the required inspections scheduled. Everything appears to be in order." David felt some of his tension ease, but he was still confused about why the police had been called in the first place. "Can I ask who made the complaint? Because I can't imagine why anyone would think this was suspicious activity." Officer Rodriguez looked at his notes. The caller identified herself as Patricia Coleman. She said she was an HOA representative and that there was illegal construction happening here. David's confusion turned to anger. Patricia had actually called 911 and made false accusations about his legitimate home improvement project. The idea that she would waste police resources and potentially create serious problems for him over their earlier disagreement seemed incredibly vindictive. Roberto, who had been standing quietly nearby with his crew, approached the officers. "Excuse me, officers. I'm Roberto Gonzalez, the licensed contractor working on this project. Here's my business license and insurance information if you need to see it." Officer Williams accepted Roberto's documentation and spent a few minutes reviewing it. "Premier Pool Services, I've heard of your company. You guys have a good reputation around here." "Thank you, sir," Roberto replied. We've been doing pool installations and removals in this area for over 15 years. We always make sure to follow all regulations and get proper permits for our work. Officer Rodriguez walked around the work site, examining the equipment and the organized debris piles. Everything looks professional and well organized to me. The caller made it sound like there was some kind of chaotic destruction happening here. David shook his head in disbelief. I honestly don't understand why she called you. We had a disagreement earlier when she came by to inspect our permits, but everything we're doing is completely legal. Officer Williams closed his notebook and handed David's documents back to him. Well, sir, as far as we can tell, there's no violation of any laws here. You've got proper permits, a licensed contractor, and everything appears to be a legitimate home improvement project. Just as the officers were preparing to leave, David heard the sound of another car pulling into his driveway. He turned to see Patricia's white sedan returning, and his heart sank. He had hoped the police visit would be the end of the drama for the day. Patricia got out of her car with her phone in her hand, already recording video as she approached the group. She was talking loudly into her phone, apparently live streaming or making a video call to someone. I'm back at the property where illegal construction is taking place, Patricia announced to her phone. The police are here, but it doesn't look like they're making any arrests yet. Officer Rodriguez looked at Patricia with obvious annoyance. Ma'am, are you the one who called in this complaint? Patricia continued recording with her phone while speaking to the officer. Yes, I am. I'm Patricia Coleman, the HOA compliance officer for this neighborhood. I reported unauthorized demolition activity and property damage. Officer Williams stepped forward with a stern expression. Ma'am, we've investigated your complaint thoroughly and we found no evidence of any illegal activity. The homeowner has proper permits for this work and everything appears to be legitimate. Patricia's voice became louder and more agitated. That's impossible. I know a violation when I see one. There has to be something wrong here. David watched in amazement as Patricia began arguing with the police officers about their investigation. She insisted that they must have missed something and demanded that they check the permits more carefully. She suggested that the documents might be forged or that David might not actually own the property. Officer Rodriguez's patience was clearly wearing thin. Ma'am, we've verified everything multiple times. Mr. Thompson is the legal owner of this property. He has valid permits for this work, and the contractor is properly licensed and insured. But Patricia wasn't satisfied with that answer. She walked around the worksite with her phone, recording everything and providing running commentary about alleged violations. She pointed at the dumpster and claimed it was illegally placed. She filmed the construction equipment and suggested it was too large for residential use. She even recorded Roberto's crew and implied they might not be authorized to be on the property. Mrs. Peterson, who had been watching from her yard, finally walked over to join the group. Officers, I've been David's neighbor for 3 years and he's always been respectful about any work he does. This woman has been harassing him all afternoon. Patricia immediately turned her phone toward Mrs. Peterson. You have no right to interfere with an official HOA investigation. Officer Williams had clearly had enough of Patricia's behavior. Ma'am, I need you to stop recording and put your phone away. You've made a complaint, we've investigated it thoroughly, and we've found no evidence of wrongdoing. Patricia reluctantly lowered her phone but continued arguing. I demand to know why no arrests are being made. This property is clearly in violation of multiple regulations. Officer Rodriguez stepped closer to Patricia with a serious expression. Ma'am, filing false police reports is a crime. We've determined that there are no violations here, and continuing to make unfounded accusations could result in charges against you. For the first time since arriving, Patricia seemed to realize that her behavior might have consequences for herself. She looked around at the neighbors who had gathered, all of whom were clearly supporting David and looking at her with disapproval. This isn't over, Patricia said, though her voice had lost some of its earlier confidence. I'm going to file complaints with the city and the HOA board. Officer Williams handed David his business card. Mr. Thompson, if this person continues to harass you or interfere with your legitimate construction project, please give us a call. You have every right to complete your permitted home improvement work without interference. As the police officers prepared to leave, David felt a mixture of relief and embarrassment. The situation had escalated far beyond anything he could have imagined when he started his pool renovation project. What should have been a simple home improvement had somehow become a neighborhood spectacle involving the police. Several neighbors approached David after the officers left, offering their support and expressing outrage at Patricia's behavior. Bob from 2 houses down said he had never seen anything like it in all his years of living in the neighborhood. Mrs. Peterson offered to write a letter to the HOA board supporting David if he needed it. Roberto and his crew began packing up their equipment for the day, clearly shaken by the unexpected police visit. Roberto apologized to David for the disruption, even though none of it had been his fault. As Patricia finally drove away, David stood in his driveway feeling exhausted and confused. He had done everything right, obtained proper permits, hired a reputable contractor, notified his neighbors, and followed all regulations. Yet somehow he had ended up being treated like a criminal in his own neighborhood. David looked at his partially demolished pool and wondered what other challenges awaited him in the coming days. The project that was supposed to improve his family's quality of life had suddenly become a source of stress and conflict that he never could have anticipated. The next morning, David woke up hoping that the previous day's drama with Patricia had been some kind of bad dream. But as he looked out his bedroom window at the construction site in his backyard, the reality of what had happened came flooding back. He felt frustrated that what should have been an exciting home improvement project had been turned into a source of stress and conflict. Jennifer had been furious when David told her about Patricia's behavior and the police visit. As a nurse, she dealt with difficult people regularly, but she couldn't understand why someone would be so hostile toward their neighbor over a legitimate construction project. Tyler had been confused and a little scared when he came home from camp to find his parents discussing police cars in their driveway. David was drinking his morning coffee when the doorbell rang. He opened the door to find Mrs. Peterson standing on his front porch with a concerned expression and a manila envelope in her hands. "Good morning, David," she said. "I hope you don't mind me stopping by so early, but I wanted to give you this." Mrs. Peterson handed him the envelope, which contained several printed pages. "After what happened yesterday, I couldn't sleep. So I stayed up late writing down everything I witnessed, and I printed out some information that I think you need to see." David opened the envelope and found a detailed, handwritten account of Patricia's behavior during the confrontation, including specific quotes and times. Mrs. Peterson had also printed several emails and documents that she had found online. "Patricia has been causing problems in this neighborhood for years," Mrs. Peterson explained. "I did some research last night and found out that she's been reported to the HOA board multiple times for harassment and overstepping her authority. This incident with you was just the latest in a long pattern of inappropriate behavior." David read through the documents with growing amazement. There were complaint letters from other homeowners describing incidents where Patricia had harassed families over minor issues, made false accusations about property violations, and even called police and city officials to make unfounded reports about her neighbors. One particularly disturbing letter was from a family who had moved away from the neighborhood, specifically because of Patricia's harassment. They described months of constant complaints, surprise inspections, and threats of fines over issues that didn't actually violate any rules. The letter detailed how Patricia had made their lives so miserable that they eventually sold their house and moved to a different community. "Why hasn't anything been done about this before now?" David asked. Mrs. Peterson sighed. "Most people were afraid to stand up to her because she claimed to represent the HOA. A lot of families just tried to avoid her or moved away rather than fight back. But what she did to you yesterday crossed a line that I don't think anyone can ignore." Over the next few hours, David discovered that he wasn't alone in his outrage over Patricia's behavior. Bob from 2 houses down stopped by with his own written statement about what he had witnessed. The family with young children across the street sent a detailed email describing their observations of the incident. Most surprisingly, David received a phone call from someone he had never met, a man named Greg who lived on the next street over. Greg had heard about what happened through the neighborhood social media group and wanted to share his own experience with Patricia. "She did the exact same thing to me 2 years ago when I was having my driveway repaired," Greg explained. "Called the police, made false accusations, harassed my contractor. I was too embarrassed to make a big deal about it at the time, but now I wish I had spoken up." By Wednesday afternoon, David had received support from more than a dozen neighbors who had either witnessed Patricia's behavior or had their own negative experiences with her. Several people volunteered to attend the next HOA board meeting to speak on David's behalf. The real breakthrough came when Bob mentioned that his teenage son had been recording videos of the construction work for a school project about home improvement. When they reviewed the footage, they discovered that the boy had accidentally captured Patricia's entire confrontation with David, including her hostile behavior and false accusations. The video clearly showed Patricia being unreasonable and aggressive, while David remained calm and professional throughout the interaction. It captured her questioning his ownership of the property, her dismissive treatment of Roberto, and her threats to file false reports with the authorities. David decided it was time to take formal action. He contacted the HOA board president, a reasonable man named Frank who had always been fair in his dealings with residents. Frank was shocked when David described what had happened and immediately agreed to call an emergency board meeting. The meeting was held on Thursday evening in the community center, and the turnout was larger than anyone expected. Word had spread throughout the neighborhood about Patricia's behavior, and dozens of residents came to show their support for David and to share their own experiences. Frank began the meeting by explaining that they were there to address serious allegations of misconduct by their compliance officer. He emphasized that the HOA was meant to serve the community, not to harass residents who were following the rules. David presented his case calmly and factually. He showed the board all his permits, contractor documentation, and the timeline for his project. He explained how Patricia had been hostile from the moment she arrived, had questioned his ownership of his own property, and had ultimately made false reports to the police. When David finished his presentation, Frank asked if anyone else wanted to speak. What followed was an hour of testimony from neighbors who described their own negative experiences with Patricia. The stories were remarkably similar: Patricia approaching residents with hostility, making unreasonable demands, threatening fines for non-existent violations, and generally making people's lives miserable. Mrs. Peterson stood up and read her detailed account of what she had witnessed during Patricia's confrontation with David. Her testimony was particularly powerful because she had lived in the neighborhood for over 20 years and was respected by everyone who knew her. The most damning evidence came when Bob's teenager showed the board the video he had accidentally recorded. The footage clearly demonstrated Patricia's unreasonable behavior and David's attempts to remain professional despite her hostility. Several board members looked visibly uncomfortable as they watched Patricia dismiss Roberto and question David's right to improve his own property. When it was Patricia's turn to defend herself, she seemed to have lost much of her earlier confidence. She claimed that she was just trying to enforce community standards and that residents were exaggerating her behavior. But her arguments fell flat in the face of so much documented evidence and consistent testimony from multiple witnesses. The board members deliberated for only 15 minutes before returning with their decision. Frank announced that Patricia was being immediately removed from her position as compliance officer and that her authority to represent the HOA in any capacity was revoked. He also announced that the board would be implementing new policies to prevent this kind of harassment from happening in the future. The room erupted in applause, and David felt a huge weight lifted from his shoulders. Justice had been served, and the community had come together to stand up against harassment and discrimination. But the story didn't end there. Over the weekend, David learned that Patricia's false police report had consequences for her as well. Officer Williams had filed paperwork documenting that she had made unfounded accusations, and the police department had noted her actions in case there were future incidents. More importantly, news of the incident had spread beyond the neighborhood. A local news reporter heard about the story through social media and contacted David about doing a feature on HOA overreach and racial profiling in suburban communities. While David was initially hesitant to seek publicity, he ultimately decided that sharing his experience might help prevent similar incidents from happening to other families. The news story brought even more support for David's family. The pool renovation continued without any further interference, and Roberto's crew was able to complete the project ahead of schedule. When the new pool was finished, it looked even better than David had imagined. True to his word, David hosted a neighborhood barbecue to celebrate the completion of his pool project. Nearly 30 families attended, including many people who had supported him during the conflict with Patricia. The event brought the community closer together and established new friendships that would last for years. Tyler was thrilled with the new pool and spent most of the summer swimming with his friends. Jennifer loved the modern filtration system that kept the water crystal clear, with much less maintenance than the old system had required. David felt proud every time he looked at his backyard, knowing that he had stood up for his rights and had the support of his community. Patricia eventually moved away from Oakwood Hills. Unable to face the social consequences of her behavior, her departure was not mourned by anyone in the neighborhood, and many residents expressed relief that they would no longer have to worry about harassment or false accusations. The incident had lasting positive effects on the community as well. The HOA board implemented new policies requiring compliance officers to receive training on fair treatment and proper procedures. They also established a grievance process for residents who felt they were being treated unfairly by HOA officials. David's experience became a powerful example of how communities can come together to address injustice and support their neighbors. His story inspired other homeowners to speak up when they witnessed discrimination or harassment, and it demonstrated that standing up for what's right can lead to positive change for everyone. Years later, when David looked back on the pool renovation project, he remembered not just the stress and conflict it had initially caused, but also the way his neighbors had rallied around his family when they needed support. The incident had revealed the true character of his community, and he felt grateful to live in a place where people were willing to stand up for each other when it mattered most. The pool that had started as a simple home improvement project had become a symbol of resilience, community solidarity, and the importance of treating all neighbors with dignity and respect. Every time David's family and friends gathered around that pool, they were reminded that justice and fairness could prevail when good people were willing to stand together against harassment and discrimination.